by our governor has to do with the teaching, the non-teaching of science in science classes in our schools, which the group who supported it and encouraged it and got it through committees, education committees, and through the legislature, we know who they are. They are the ones who are the religious radicals. But it has been passed into law. What is your view on that law?
If you read the legislation, it's pretty simplistic and pretty basic. It just says that a teacher is not prohibited and can discuss the fact that at some point when the big fire began, somebody or something had to strike the match. And so that's pretty simplistic. I think a good teacher can take that law and not really get into religious connotations or slant one way or the other. The problem is, who's going to teach that good teacher? Where are the rules? How's that going to be put into effect? That can be abused, but for that matter, a lot of our laws can be abused. I think that hopefully that it's there on the books. It's something Governor Jindal pushed very strongly. I'm not so hung up on it to think it's a do or die fight, quite frankly, if it's handled correctly. I guess that, and I struggle with this like so many of your viewers out there do, but as you get a little older and you start dealing with your family, your focus is, okay, let's deal with the here and the now and not worry about where we're going to be 50 years or 100 years down the line. Now, creationism comes into the mix and says some pretty simple things in the act. It just says that a point of discussion has to be that someone had to strike that match, and that's something that can be at least laid out as one alternative. Now, if that's all it does, I'm not that concerned about it. The problem is that it could be taken a heck of a lot further, and that would be a legitimate concern.
This act, which they first called the Louisiana Academic Freedom Act, and then they changed it to Science Education Act, on the face of it, is supposed to allow the science teachers, to then bring in supplemental material into their science class that may apply to the theories of evolution, of global warming, and cloning. They named those specifically. Now, right now, a science teacher, if she has some supplemental scientific information, she can bring it into her classroom. But knowing who supported this bill, that is not what they're after. This is subterfuge. I'm looking just at an editorial in the Baton Rouge Advocate newspaper very recently, and it says, Governor Bobby Jindal ought to veto he already has signed it, ought to veto the neo-creationism bill that is now heading to his desk. The practical matter is that he won't, and he didn't. Yet we fear that its passage will be, sooner as well as later, an embarrassment for the state of Louisiana. The so-called Louisiana Science Education Act is on its face a defense of academic freedom, but in reality pushed by the advocates of Bible-based notions of creation and the formation of the earth. Farrar, I know you have some opinions on this.
Well, I was wondering, when did teachers lose that freedom? When did it have to be defended? I did not grow up here. I was not part of the Louisiana educational system. I grew up in North Carolina. But very frequently, our science teachers would have textbooks that were not quite completely up to date, and so the teacher would bring in one of their magazines, National Geographic, Discover, what have you, Scientific American, and say, now, here's a recent publication on this subject that we're studying, and they would have some more recent information. I doubt that at any point in Louisiana's educational history that was forbidden. So I kind of wonder why this bill was necessary to defend the teacher's ability to bring in supplemental material. When I think of supplemental material, that's what I think of. I think of something perhaps more recent than the textbook, or something that's more specific that can enhance the learning of that.
When I was debating this with a representative of the Louisiana Family Forum, which is part of the creationist group, she said, well, the textbooks were 5 years old on evolution. Now, I don't know what new scientific information has been developed in the last 5 years, but if there is any, and she says, we just want to bring the science up to date. Well, the teachers can do that now. They didn't need a law to do it. And in fact, in this law, they specifically say that this is not intended to bring any religious information. They put that in there because they are certainly expecting lawsuits as soon as
But if the law says that, again, I can see where there could be abuses, but isn't the devil in the details? I mean, you're making an assumption here that Mr. Pastorak, that's the superintendent of all our schools in the state, that each of our schools superintendents in all of our parishes are all going to get together and wield a massive effort to bring into the school system religious connotations. I just don't see that big of a nefarious plot out there to do something like that. So, you can get bogged down in that concern, and we're going to see lawsuits filed. In focus, it probably wasn't that necessary. On the other hand, from my point of view, when you look at priorities, I don't think we're going to warp the mind of our young children. You got to remember that half our kids are in private schools already anyway, and quite frankly, the better and the brightest are in private schools in the state. So, if there's a little overlap that goes towards throwing out a little Christian doctrine, I don't think in the scheme of things, in the priorities of this state with the problems we've got in this city, it's that big of a deal. But to some, it is. So,
since you mentioned private schools, the legislature did something else. Vouchers for school children in Orleans Parish, because they said this is where we have bad public schools. And so they have approved this money to come to Orleans Parish to private schools, and this is just for kindergarten and the very early grades. Now, what private schools have facilities in Orleans Parish now to accept these students? It's the parochial schools. Now, so this is state taxpayers' money going to a church school. Now, I understand that the Catholic schools accept the theory of evolution completely. They don't consider that incompatible with their views. But those children who get the vouchers and go to a parochial school are also going to have classes in religion. How does that stack up with the separation of church and state?
Well, I think we'll see some litigation on that, although voucher programs are in effect in a number of cities throughout this country, and so far the courts have not put a limit to it. And what you may see is, you're right that parochial schools could take advantage of it, although I've seen a lot of concern on my radio show from parents who say, we don't want vouchered kids in our schools. We work too hard to struggle ourselves, and we want to limit that. So it's not all that cut and dried. You also may see a number of other private experimental schools open up that could allow the use of those vouchers. Well, I guess there's a huge frustration over the fact that we are rock bottom in our educational system. It was a failure before Katrina. For all practical purposes, it's a big failure right now. And out of frustration, I think the legislature is trying to grasp for straws.
But how do you make the Orleans Parish schools better if you take away their money and give it to the private schools and reduce the funds available to the public schools to improve themselves? Isn't that contrary to what they're trying to do?
Well, you get a public school that spends $5,000 to $6,000 per kid. You get a parochial school that does for $2,500 to $3,000 a kid. So you talk about the efficiencies and all the dollars in the system, and I think it's just a focus of frustration. Can you screw it up any more than it is right now?
Well, but can you improve it? The question is, can you improve it? Farrar, you wanted to say something about that.
Well, forgive me for bringing pessimism into it, but a friend of mine has the view, and I am beginning to agree with it. He says, once I hear the word voucher, I hear underneath there, I hear a subtext of, we've given up on public schools, which is kind of a shame, because I didn't go to public school here, but I had 13 years of public school in North Carolina, and I took trumpet lessons from a man who taught at a state school, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And for the most part, the people who actually worked at the public schools were there because they believed in public school. They could have taught at a private school perhaps and got more money and more freedom, but these were people who came from a public school background and they wanted to give